What has just happened in Bogota over the last 72 hours is not a simple diplomatic clash. It is the most violent geopolitical earthquake that has shaken the Western Hemisphere since that terrifying missile crisis in 1962. And if you think I'm exaggerating, wait until you hear what is really happening behind the curtains of global power. Because what looks like a trade dispute between Colombia and the United States is actually the exact moment when the global South said enough and decided to write its own rules of the game, leaving Washington completely paralyzed without a single move on the board that does not end in self-destruction. Gustavo Petro has just achieved something that no Latin American leader had dared to do in an entire century: to transform the economic aggression of the United States into the perfect fuel to accelerate integration with the emerging powers of Asia. And he has executed it with such surgical precision, so brilliantly calculated, that the White House was left without viable responses. Let's go back just 1 week in time. Donald Trump, true to his schoolyard bully style, decided to punish Colombia for refusing to accept deportation flights without minimum guarantees of human rights. Washington's response was instant and brutal: absolute blockade of all Colombian imports, immediate freezing of bank accounts on U.S. soil, total prohibition on exporting dollars to Colombia, and the veiled but clear threat of secondary sanctions against any nation that dared to trade with Bogota. It was the classic manual of economic strangulation that the United States has applied with devastating success for decades against Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran. The recipe had always worked because the power of the dollar as the backbone of the global financial system meant one simple thing. When Washington turned off the tap, the target country went into total panic. Its currency plunged like a stone. Inflation exploded out of control. Widespread shortages appeared. And within weeks, the cornered government had to capitulate and humbly accept the conditions imposed from the North. But something has changed radically in the economic architecture of the planet, and Gustavo Petro grasped it with a clarity that caught the entire U.S. intelligence community completely off guard. Because instead of panicking, instead of sending desperate envoys to Washington to beg for clemency, the Colombian government did exactly the opposite. It convened an emergency summit with China, Brazil, Mexico, and the CELAC countries, and in less than 48 hours built what they now call the Sovereign Logistic Shield Alliance, a revolutionary mechanism of commercial and financial integration that simply removes the United States from the equation and replaces it with actors who are more than happy to occupy that vacant space. Let me explain how this masterstroke works, because it is absolutely brilliant from any angle of political economy. The first component is the immediate activation of the dry interoceanic corridor, basically an advanced network of high-speed railways and highways that connect the port of Buenaventura on the Colombian Pacific with the Caribbean ports of Cartagena and Barranquilla. But here comes the brilliant part, the one that left Washington's strategists speechless. This critical infrastructure will not be operated solely by Colombia. It will function under a special jurisdiction shared with Chinese state-owned companies, specifically Costoping, the shipping giant controlled by the government of Beijing. Under this revolutionary agreement, any cargo that enters or leaves through these ports automatically falls under the legal and logistical protection of the Chinese flag. Translation: if the United States wanted to physically block these ships, it would be initiating an act of war not against Colombia, but against the People's Republic of China, a nuclear power. Think about the strategic implications of this for a moment. The United States has the most lethal navy on the planet. It has military bases surrounding every continent. It can project destructive force in any ocean in the world. But all that impressive military power becomes completely useless when your adversary is a nuclear superpower with whom you cannot enter into open war without unleashing the end of the world as we know it. Petro has effectively outsourced the defense of his trade routes to a rival power, and he did it using the very rules of the free market that the United States claims to defend. It is geopolitical judo in its purest expression, using the opponent's weight and momentum to neutralize them without even throwing a punch. But the alliance does not stop there. This is where things get truly fascinating from an economic perspective. The second component is a massive trade swap agreement in which China commits to buying in advance all the production of coffee, flowers, coal, and fruit that the United States has just rejected in its economic attack. And we are not talking about empty promises on diplomatic paper. We are talking about Chinese ships sailing right now toward Buenaventura to pick up the cargo. Colombia is literally not going to lose a single peso of income from the US blockade because it simply changed clients, reoriented its production from the saturated North American market to the Asian market, which has 4 times more consumers and a rapidly expanding middle class hungry for premium products such as high-quality Colombian coffee. And for those thinking this process is going to take time, that the Colombian economy is going to suffer during the transition, let me tell you what happened in the financial markets in the last 24 hours when the alliance was officially announced. The Colombian peso, which had begun to wobble due to the initial panic, stabilized instantly and even appreciated slightly. The reason? The People's Bank of China activated a massive currency swap line of 30 billion yuan to fully back the liquidity of the Colombian financial system. This means something revolutionary. Colombian importers no longer need to obtain US dollars to buy machinery, technology, or manufactured goods. Now they can pay directly in Chinese yuan, and the Colombian central bank has the necessary reserves to support those transactions without issues. It is accelerated de-dollarization, not due to abstract ideology, but because of immediate practical necessity, and it is working perfectly. I want you to understand the absolute level of panic this is generating in the corridors of power in Washington. Let me explain something fundamental about how US dominance really works in the modern world. The United States is not the largest economy because it produces more things. In fact, much of its industrial base disappeared decades ago, exported to China and other countries. The real power of the United States in the global economy comes from 2 critical sources: the dollar as the world's reserve currency and its absolute control over international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. As long as all other countries need to obtain dollars to trade internationally, as long as they must maintain massive dollar reserves to stabilize their currencies, as long as they require access to the SWIFT system to make international bank transfers, Washington has the power to economically strangle any nation that steps out of line simply by cutting off its access to that system. It is institutionalized economic blackmail on a planetary scale. But what Colombia has just demonstrated to the entire world is that this power is no longer absolute nor inevitable. There is an alternative infrastructure patiently built by China over the last 2 decades, while Washington was distracted bombing the Middle East. The CIPS international payment system, China's alternative to SWIFT, the digital yuan, which allows direct transactions without going through the Western banking system, bilateral swap agreements between central banks that completely eliminate the need for the dollar as an intermediary. All these tools were there, waiting for the right moment to be activated, and Colombia has just pressed that button with consequences that will resonate for decades. Now comes the part that is really going to make blood boil at the State Department because it turns out Colombia did not act alone in this. Brazil and Mexico simultaneously announced that they will immediately activate preferential trade agreements with Colombia to offset any loss of the U.S. market. Lula da Silva was particularly direct. Any product that the United States rejects, Brazil will buy at double the price as an act of Latin American solidarity. Mexico fully opened its markets, eliminating all tariffs on Colombian products, and Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, every CELAC country is doing the same. The United States has not only lost Colombia as a docile trade partner, it is losing influence over the entire continent simultaneously, a slow-motion domino effect that no strategist in Washington had foreseen in their worst nightmares. The masterstroke lies in the third component of the alliance, the payment settlement system in local currencies. China, Brazil, and Mexico agreed to create a regional clearinghouse where they can trade directly using their own currencies without touching a single dollar. A Colombian exporter can sell coffee to China and receive yuan, use that yuan to buy machinery from Brazil, paying in reais, and Brazil can use those same reais to buy electronics from Mexico, paying in pesos. The dollar simply disappears from the equation. It is the Latin American dream of monetary integration that had been germinating for decades, finally materialized by Washington's clumsy aggression. And the U.S. response has been pathetically predictable. Empty threats, sanctions that nobody respects, warnings about consequences that never arrive. Because the brutal reality Washington is now discovering is that its imperial power fundamentally depended on there being no viable alternatives. The moment an alternative infrastructure exists, capable of functioning without the dollar, the whole house of cards begins to wobble, and there is no way to rebuild it because trust, once broken, is almost impossible to restore. Every country that saw what happened to Colombia now knows with absolute certainty that having your entire economy tied to the dollar is an unacceptable existential risk. They are going to diversify. They are going to seek alternatives. They are going to build backup systems. The process is irreversible. Let me be absolutely clear about something crucial that corporate media are deliberately ignoring. This does not mean that China is now the new benevolent empire that is going to liberate Latin America. That would be a childish reading of the situation. China has its own strategic and economic interests and is going to pursue them just as aggressively as the United States did. The fundamental difference is that in a multipolar world, no single actor has the power to impose its will unilaterally. Medium-sized countries like Colombia gain room to maneuver. They can play different powers against each other. They can negotiate better terms because there is competition for their loyalty. It is not paradise, but it is infinitely better than the alternative of having a single empire dictating terms at gunpoint with military and economic threats. And here comes another fascinating dimension that is unfolding in real time. The European Union, which is officially an ally of the United States, is watching all of this with a mixture of horror and fascination, because it turns out that many European countries are in exactly the same position as Colombia, tired of being treated as vassals by Washington, tired of having to follow policies that hurt their own economic interests simply because the United States orders it. Germany lost its cheap Russian gas supply due to U.S. pressure and now faces deindustrialization. France sees its companies massively fined for violating U.S. sanctions that are not even European. Italy had to reject Chinese investments in infrastructure because Washington threatened consequences. Resentment has been growing for years, and what Colombia has shown is that it is possible to resist. Cracks in the Atlantic Alliance are going to begin appearing much faster than anyone anticipated. Meanwhile, in Washington, the panic is reaching historic levels. Think tanks are producing desperate strategy papers. Corporate media are trying to downplay the importance of what happened. Politicians are looking for scapegoats to blame. But the uncomfortable truth that no one wants to admit publicly is that the United States has just lost a crucial battle in the war to maintain its global hegemony. And it did not lose it because Colombia is militarily powerful or economically dominant. It lost because the world changed and Washington refused to adapt. It kept behaving as if we were still in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States was left as the single superpower without rivals. That world died years ago, but the U.S. ruling class lives in absolute denial of that reality. The question now is not whether the U.S. unipolar order is going to end, because it already has. The question is, what kind of world order is going to emerge from the ashes? And that is a genuinely open question with monumental consequences for every person on the planet, because we could be entering an era of multipolar cooperation where different development models coexist and compete peacefully, or we could be entering a new Cold War, this time with 3 or 4 power blocks facing off, armed to the teeth, playing dangerous games of nuclear brinkmanship. Or we could be witnessing the beginning of a complete systemic collapse where no stable order emerges and we enter decades of geopolitical chaos. From Latin America, the crucial lesson of what Colombia has just achieved is that regional integration is not just a nice ideological aspiration. It is an urgent strategic necessity for economic and political survival. A Latin American country acting alone will always be vulnerable to pressure from the great powers. But Latin America acting as a unified bloc with 500 million inhabitants, massive natural resources, and growing markets has real geopolitical weight. It can negotiate as an equal with any world power. The historical problem has always been that Latin American elites prefer to compete among themselves for imperial crumbs rather than unite to transform the system. What is happening now suggests that this might finally be changing, not driven by ideology, but by pure survival need. And as all this unfolds, there is another layer of complexity we cannot ignore: the climate factor. Because it turns out that this geopolitical reconfiguration is happening precisely as we face the most severe climate crisis in the history of human civilization. And the way this struggle for global power is resolved will determine whether we have any chance to coordinate an effective response to climate collapse. If we enter a new Cold War with rival blocs, each prioritizing strategic advantages over environmental cooperation, we are doomed. If we manage to build a multipolar system capable of coordination on existential issues while maintaining competition in other areas, then maybe we have a chance. Colombia, without necessarily intending to, has just made a massive contribution to that second scenario by showing that it is possible to resist imperial domination without resorting to violence or military confrontation. I am going to be brutally honest about something that keeps me awake at night. We are in a moment of extraordinary danger. Empires in decline are extremely dangerous because they often prefer to destroy what they cannot control rather than accept a loss of power. The United States has the military capability to end human civilization multiple times over. It has covert operations active in practically every country in the hemisphere. It has allies willing to carry out coups, assassinations, destabilization operations, and it has a political class that has repeatedly shown it is willing to use all those resources to maintain imperial domination. What happened in Colombia in recent days could trigger exactly that kind of desperate response. That is why it is absolutely critical that we understand what is happening and communicate these realities as widely as possible, because the only protection countries like Colombia have against covert imperial aggression is international visibility, ensuring that enough people in enough places are paying attention and ready to respond if Washington tries its usual tricks. Every person who understands these dynamics, who can explain them to others, who can mobilize if necessary, is a small barrier against the worst possible scenarios. This brings us to our responsibility as people aware of these global power dynamics. We cannot simply be passive spectators while the future of the world order is decided. We have to organize, educate ourselves, mobilize in our own communities and countries. If you are in the United States, your job is to resist the imperialism of your own government, to push for an end to economic wars and covert operations, to demand that the massive resources wasted on external domination be invested in communities devastated by decades of neoliberalism. And if you are in Latin America, your job is to pressure your governments to use this new strategic autonomy for the benefit of the popular majority, not privileged elites, to ensure that integration with China is not just a new extractivism, but part of a real strategy of industrial and technological development. That is why channels like Wolf Economico Fans Club are fundamental at this historical moment. Not because I have all the answers, but because we are creating spaces where these crucial conversations can happen, where we can learn collectively, where we can break the information monopoly of corporate media that systematically hide or distort these realities. I invite you to subscribe to the channel if you find this content valuable, to share these analyses with friends and family, to comment with your own perspectives, because we need to build together a deeper understanding of the forces that are reshaping our world. And the more of us there are who understand these dynamics, the greater our capacity to influence their final direction. The crisis between Colombia and the United States is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a much broader systemic transformation, the painful end of the U.S. unipolar moment and the chaotic birth of a multipolar world order. That process is going to define the living conditions of billions of people in the coming decades. It will determine whether we have a future in which international cooperation can address existential crises, or one in which rival powers compete destructively while the planet burns. It will determine whether the fruits of technological development are distributed fairly or concentrated even more obscenely in the hands of global elites. These are not abstract academic questions. They are deeply practical issues that affect whether people can eat, whether they can access healthcare, whether they can live with basic dignity. And the only way to influence the answers is by organizing collectively based on a shared understanding of how power really works in the world. That is why the political education work we do here matters vitally. That is why we need to keep having these uncomfortable conversations. That is why we cannot allow cynicism or despair to paralyze us. Friends, I thank you deeply for making it to the end of this analysis. If you have questions, comments, disagreements, I read them all. If you want to support Wolf Economico Fans Club, you can do so by subscribing, turning on notifications, and sharing this content with others who might benefit from these critical perspectives. We will continue analyzing these developments as they evolve, because this story is far from over. In fact, it is only just beginning. The only way to change the world is first to understand it and then to organize collectively to transform it. See you in the next one.